Hello and welcome to a revision video. In this video we're going to be looking at to what extent did the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 have a detrimental impact on the lives of Germans in 1923. So it's worth noting that this question specifically says the hyperinflation crisis and not the invasion of the Ruhr and hyperinflation crisis. So this gives you something to argue against. So during the course of this revision video, we will discuss whether it's actually hyperinflation or the invasion of the Ruhr, for example, that causes political problems. For the purpose of this revision video, we're going to be arguing that the most detrimental impact of hyperinflation was economic, followed by political, and then finally by social impacts. So let's start by looking at the most significant detrimental impact of the hyperinflation crisis, which is the economic impact. So the economic impact of the hyperinflation crisis is obviously hugely significant. A really good statistic to use is that in October 1923, inflation had reached around 29,500%. So the prices for goods had gone from doubling every 4 days or so to doubling, increasing during the day. So workers had to become paid twice a day as prices were rising so quickly that otherwise their wages wouldn't keep in line with inflation. And there's lots of well-known stories about people stealing wheelbarrows rather than piles of banknotes because the wheelbarrows were worth more than the banknotes inside them. So we know that inflation is incredibly high, and obviously that's a very detrimental impact on the lives of Germans because day to day it's impacting how they're paid, how they're able to buy things in shops, and in particular that affects women who would have been largely at this time the people going out to get food and provisions for the family. However, it could be argued that it's not just hyperinflation that had a detrimental impact on the economy, it's also the invasion of the Ruhr itself, since passive resistance in the Ruhr happened as a result of the invasion. So passive resistance was also affecting the economy because it was decreasing production. It might sound silly because it's just one area of Germany where there's passive resistance, but we have to remember that the Ruhr was the industrial heartland of Germany at the time. Approximately 80% of their coal and iron and steel industries were based there. So passive resistance, because of the invasion of the Ruhr, was also significantly decreasing Germany's income at the time. So it's not just hyperinflation that's having an impact on the economy. It's also being compounded by the occupation itself, since that was causing the passive resistance there. So we could argue that the economic impact is obviously huge. There's around sort of 25% unemployment by October 1923, 29,500% inflation, but it's not just caused by the hyperinflation crisis, it's also the occupation of the Ruhr itself. And linking nicely into this, we can have a look at the political impact of hyperinflation and the detrimental impact that it had on this. And similarly, we could argue that actually it's not just hyperinflation that causes political problems, it's also other things. Probably one of our best pieces of evidence that the hyperinflation crisis did cause political problems would be how frequently Article 48 was being used. President Ebert used it a total of 63 times just in this 1 year, 1923 to 24, because he was having to deal with deadlock in the Reichstag since the parties were finding it too difficult to agree on what to do about things like the large number of unemployed people and the benefits system and things like that. So that's a really good piece of specific evidence that hyperinflation did lead to political crisis, since he's having to use emergency powers 63 times through that year. And hyperinflation is also partly responsible for a number of significant uprisings that happen through 1923, in particular September, October, November 1923. So in September we see the Küstrin Putsch, which is the Black Reichswehr. They are actually civilian volunteers officially, although actually unofficially they're members of the army, but they can't be revealed as that because of the Treaty of Versailles. So these unofficial army people are involved in an uprising near Berlin, which is known as the Küstrin Putsch. It only lasts one day. Around 7 people are wounded and only 1 person's killed. And I think about 381 arrests were made as a result of the putsch. It's relatively small scale, but it is an example of a right-wing uprising that happens that's triggered by hyperinflation crisis, but not just the hyperinflation crisis. So similarly to what we've mentioned with the economy, a lot of what's going on here is really triggered by the occupation of the Ruhr and not simply by hyperinflation. So the occupation had happened in January 1923, and we know that that had already triggered an increase in support for more extremist parties. So the troops, although unofficially troops, they're technically civilian volunteers that are involved in this Küstrin Putsch, are actually largely involved in this uprising against the Weimar Republic because they don't like the fact that Stresemann was asking people to stop opposing the occupation of the Ruhr and to just go along with it. So actually we could argue it's not the hyperinflation crisis that causes the putsch, but it's actually the occupation of the Ruhr and Stresemann's response to that. And similarly, we could argue that this also was a trigger for lots of the communist revolts as well, that they were unhappy with the way that the occupation of the Ruhr was being dealt with. We could obviously argue that communist uprisings, so for example, in October 1923 in Hamburg, there's a communist uprising. Whilst it's significant that there is one and there's an attempt to overthrow the Republic there, it's not a particularly big threat. It's not a hugely detrimental impact on the lives of ordinary Germans. Only about 300 people were involved. And although 100 people were killed or died during the uprising, there is a general lack of support for this uprising and it's quickly put down. So it only lasts for 2 days. And a good statistic is that there were actually 14,000 members of the KPD party in Hamburg at the time, and only 300 being involved shows us a real lack of support for the uprising, since it means that only just over 2% of local KPD members were actually involved or really bought the idea of trying to overthrow the Republic in that one city. The Munich Beer Hall Putsch in November 1923 is another example of a political uprising which is partially triggered by hyperinflation, but also, again, partially triggered by the occupation of the Ruhr as well, and kind of feelings against that, and strong feelings against Stresemann's acceptance of that occupation. Again, it's a relatively significant event. It lasts for 2 days. There are around about 2,000 people involved. About 20 people were killed, including 1 civilian, but it is relatively easily put down. So in terms of the political impact and how detrimental it was on the lives of Germans, it was relatively detrimental to a fair extent. But it's not like these uprisings are particularly widespread, and they're quite quickly put down. So it's not a major concern for ordinary people. And that brings us to our final point that we're looking at, which is the social impact of the hyperinflation crisis. And I would actually argue that the social impact was quite limited, although for some groups of people there was a significant impact. So in particular, if you were looking at sources, for example, you might find that students or pensioners or those on sickness benefits, people who had fixed incomes, would struggle more because their incomes aren't being reassessed as regularly as those on wages, and so their income wouldn't keep up with the rate of inflation, which obviously by October was changing sort of twice a day for those on wages. And also the middle stand or the middle class who lost savings because the savings wouldn't change in value in the bank at the same rate that inflation was changing. So the savings that they had in the bank very quickly became worthless because of the value of the mark decreasing so rapidly. However, there were actually quite a lot of people who benefited socially from the hyperinflation crisis, which sounds a little bit confusing. But if you consider that there were people with loans, so anyone who, in particular, sort of businesses and people who had mortgages, who had some kind of a loan, they would be able to pay those off really quickly and easily because the debt that they owed and the interest rates, which tended to be fixed, basically was quite quick and easy for them to pay off because it was a set number of marks and they were being paid huge numbers of marks because of inflation, so they could quickly pay off the debts that they owed. So those groups of people actually benefited from the hyperinflation crisis. And as a result of that, also, rather strangely, the number of bankruptcies was actually quite low in the 1923 hyperinflation crisis because although some small businesses did go bankrupt, quite a lot of businesses were able to pay off large loans that they had and didn't lose out necessarily because they were just putting prices up in line with inflation. And along those lines also, although the working class didn't necessarily benefit from the hyperinflation crisis, they didn't get impacted particularly detrimentally other than it being a nuisance because their wages were renegotiated each day, and by October 1923 twice a day, and similarly the farmers' products remained in high demand because obviously food is always in demand, and they just continued raising their prices in line with inflation. So they didn't lose out particularly, although obviously they would have found it a nuisance. Obviously, we have to mention unemployment. So there are groups of people who do lose their jobs. There's around 25% unemployment in October 1923. Businesses are trying to sort of cut back on the people that they're paying and things like that to save. And there are groups of people who are particularly badly impacted. So, for example, the miners. Obviously, we mentioned 80% of coal and steel and iron and things like that coming from the rear. They're all on strike. So miners who were unemployed and things like that would have been more detrimentally impacted by the hyperinflation crisis. The government did take some action. So in 1923, unemployment relief was simplified and sort of streamlined into one organisation to try and make it easier for people to access that help. And also, similarly, specifically for miners, for the reasons we mentioned, social insurance was streamlined from around 100 agencies into one agency to make things a little bit easier. But obviously, those groups of people would have been more impacted than sort of bigger businesses and farmers and the working class who sustained their jobs during this period. So if we return to our kind of big picture, to what extent did hyperinflation have a detrimental impact on the lives of Germans in 1923? We could say that obviously economically It had a significant impact. Politically, its impact was perhaps more limited. A lot of the political unrest was more as a result of ill feeling about the acceptance of occupation of the Ruhr rather than the lack of action about hyperinflation. And socially, the impact was quite varied. So some groups on fixed incomes and the middle classes were worse affected, and other groups actually benefited as a result of that hyperinflation crisis. I hope that this has been a useful video. Best of luck with your revision. Don't forget to keep thinking about source analysis, so see if you can find yourself some sources in your textbook and have a go at analysing them using this content, or try planning an essay with a similar theme but a slightly different question, perhaps looking at how significant economic problems were 1919 to 23 compared to political and social problems. Best of luck with your revision.